The story of humanity stretches back billions of years. Roughly 3 billion years ago, the earliest building blocks of life, microscopic atoms, floated in Earth's primordial soup, waiting to combine into something greater. Fast forward to around 6 million years ago, and we witness the emergence of the first hominids, the primate family that would eventually give rise to humans. Then, about 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus became the first human ancestor to migrate out of Africa, spreading across distant continents. With their larger brains and enhanced adaptability, they marked a significant step in our evolutionary path. By 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals entered the scene. These early humans were well adapted to the frigid climates of Europe and Western Asia, and their physical traits bore striking similarities to our own. Eventually, only one species of the Homo genus remained, us, Homo sapiens. But what set Homo sapiens apart? What led our kind to dominate the globe? The answer lies in a single transformative force: civilization. Our journey begins in the rich, fertile cradle of Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE, between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the Sumerian city of Uruk. Unlike our ancestors who hunted and gathered to survive, the people of Uruk discovered how to cultivate cereal grains like wheat and barley. But transforming these grains into food required innovation and effort. Early on, they developed a tool called the hand mill, 2 stones used to crush grain into flour, which was then stored for later use. This was no small step. It marked the birth of agriculture, the first great leap toward modern civilization. No longer reliant on the unpredictability of wild game or seasonal fruits, humans could now produce food themselves. This ingenuity fueled the growth of Uruk, which soon became home to over 50,000 people. Yet this progress came at a cost. As humans transitioned to farming, our physical stature changed dramatically. The average male height dropped from 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 3 inches, and women from 5 feet 3 inches to 5 feet. We were no longer robust hunters, but smaller, grounded agriculturalists. Tied to land and routine, we redefined what it meant to be human. By the early 3000 BCE, legend tells us of King Gilgamesh, the great ruler of Uruk. But by the century's end, the power dynamic had shifted. The Akkadians, led by Sargon the Great, rose to power, conquering all of Sumer and bringing the Sumerian age to a close. Meanwhile, far to the east, in what is now Pakistan, a remarkable civilization was flourishing: the Indus Valley civilization, active from around 3,300 to 1,300 BCE. What made this society stand out was not vast monuments or grand military conquests, but something more quietly revolutionary: plumbing. The cities of the Indus Valley featured a sophisticated sanitation system far ahead of their time. Homes were equipped with toilets, constructed with seats and connected to chutes that led into underground drainage networks. These covered drains carried waste away from residential areas, a proactive approach to hygiene that dramatically reduced the spread of disease. Waste disposal occurred outside the city limits, maintaining urban cleanliness and setting a new standard in public health for the ancient world. In Egypt, however, priorities looked very different. Rather than investing in sanitation, their focus turned skyward, toward the pyramids. Why? Because in the beliefs of ancient Egyptian religion, death was merely a transition. It was believed that the pharaoh's spirit would live on in the afterlife, where he would continue to rule eternally. To prepare for this sacred journey, each pharaoh had their body mummified, preserving it for the next world. Their pyramids became grand tombs, stocked with treasure and offerings to ensure prosperity beyond death. Eternal legacy was the goal. Immortality wasn't just hoped for, it was engineered. This ambition began with Pharaoh Djoser, 2667 to 2648 BCE, who commissioned the first step pyramid at Saqqara. Then came Sneferu, 2613 to 2589 BCE, a prolific builder responsible for the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. But it was Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BCE, who would go on to build one of the most iconic structures in human history, the Great Pyramid of Giza. This monumental project took an estimated 20 years and untold human effort. Following in his footsteps, his successors, pharaohs Khafre and Menkaure, constructed the second and third pyramids at Giza, slightly smaller but no less impressive. Meanwhile, in China, around 2100 BCE, legend speaks of the dawn of its first dynasty, the Xia. Just like their Mesopotamian counterparts, early Chinese communities relied heavily on agriculture, growing rice, wheat, and barley, but nature often stood in the way. The Yellow River, sometimes called China's Sorrow, was prone to catastrophic floods that devastated crops and brought famine. Amid this chaos rose a legendary hero, Yu the Great. Determined to solve the crisis, Yu traveled along the riverbanks, devising innovative solutions. He directed floodwaters using levees, canals, and dikes, slowly taming the river's wrath. After 13 tireless years, the floods were brought under control. Yu's efforts earned him legendary status, and his leadership became the foundation of the Xia dynasty. Though modern scholars debate the historical accuracy of this tale, its message left a lasting mark. Leadership should be earned by merit. The belief that power should be given to those who prove themselves worthy would echo through Chinese history, and eventually the world. Back in Mesopotamia, around 1772 BCE, King Hammurabi of Babylon laid the foundations of a legal system that still influences us today. He commissioned a massive stone stele, 7 feet tall and 2 feet wide, engraved with 282 laws every citizen had to obey. Among these laws were Law 1. If a man accuses another of murder but can't prove it, the accuser shall face death. Law 196. If a man destroys another's eye, his eye shall be destroyed in return. Law 197. If he breaks another man's bone, that bone shall be broken as punishment. Law 199. If he harms a slave, he must pay half the slave's value as compensation. Hammurabi didn't just create laws. He structured society itself around them. People were ranked by strict social classes, with different rights and values. Equality wasn't an option. Nobles were worth more than commoners, who in turn were worth more than slaves. This harsh hierarchy is a theme we'll see echoed throughout history. In what is now Turkey, the Hittite Empire rose under the leadership of Labarnas, 1680 to 1650 BCE. Labarnas was a clever and determined ruler with one goal: to unite the scattered Hittite city-states under one rule. He led his armies city by city, conquering rivals and forming alliances with local leaders. A skilled diplomat, Labarnas won over the people's loyalty as well as their leaders. Eventually, he became the undisputed ruler of all Hittite lands, founding a powerful empire. His reign was marked by fairness and justice, earning him the love and respect of his subjects. Under Labarnas, the Hittite Empire flourished and expanded, bringing it into close contact with ancient Egypt. Meanwhile, on the European mainland in modern Greece, a network of city-states was taking shape. Mycenaean Greece, 1600 to 1100 BCE, was dominated by a warrior elite and featured palace-centered states with rigid political, social, and economic hierarchies. Each city-state was independent, ruled by its own king, and surrounded by its territory. Cities like Troy, Mycenae, and Pylos began to grow in prominence. This period also saw the earliest traces of Greek writing emerge, Linear B, offering us the first records of the Indo-European Greek language. Back in Egypt, society was organized like a towering pyramid, broad at the base and narrowing as it reached the top, much like the Great Pyramid of Giza itself. At the very bottom were the peasants and slaves. These laborers carried the burden of manual work, toiling daily in the fields to produce food for the entire kingdom. When the farming season ended, their hands turned to the pharaoh's colossal construction projects, including the very pyramids that still inspire awe today. Just above them were the artisans, skilled stonemasons, plasterers, and sculptors who crafted the elaborate art and monuments that Egypt is famously known for. Their creativity and skill brought beauty and grandeur to the civilization. Next came the merchants. Navigating the Nile's currents, they traded valuable goods such as gold, papyrus, and fine linen. Respected in society, merchants enjoyed prosperous lives by connecting Egypt to the wider world. Then there were the scribes, educated specialists trained in reading and writing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were the empire's record keepers, managing inventories of food, tax documents, and even the daily affairs of the pharaoh himself. Soldiers stood above the scribes, sworn to protect the empire's borders and maintain peace within. Well-fed and disciplined, they were essential to Egypt's security and often took part in preemptive campaigns against foes. Near the pyramid's apex were the bureaucrats, high-ranking officials who ensured the smooth running of the state. Viziers managed logistics, priests cared for temples and maintained religious duties, and nobles governed provinces, enforcing order and loyalty. At the very summit sat the pharaoh, the divine king and the vital link between the gods and mankind. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was supreme, deserving absolute obedience. Upon death, the pharaoh was entombed in a pyramid, securing his eternal role as ruler over Egypt in the afterlife. Egyptian society existed solely to serve the pharaoh. Farmers paid taxes to sustain him. Artisans crafted treasures in his honor. Merchants supplied necessary goods. Scribes documented his reign. Soldiers defended his empire. Bureaucrats handled affairs beyond his reach. Meanwhile, the pharaoh communicated directly with the gods, embodying their will on earth. One of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, thrived within this social system. He commissioned grand monuments such as the temples of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and the vast Temple of Karnak. Under his leadership, the Egyptian empire expanded, reclaiming many lost territories, except for those held by the formidable Hittite Empire. During the late 13th century BCE, tensions between two great powers reached their boiling point: Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, 1295 to 1272 BCE, was notorious for his aggressive expansionist policies. Inspired by his ancestor Labarnas, he sought to unite the world under Hittite rule, and that meant challenging Egypt. But Egypt now had Ramses II, a pharaoh unlike any other. Unlike his predecessors, who had only tried to slow the Hittites, Ramses was ready to strike back, and his target was the strategically vital city of Kadesh, near the modern-day border of Syria and Lebanon. Ramses led his army northward in 4 divisions, numbering around 20,000 soldiers, riding boldly into battle on his war chariot. His goal was clear: defeat Mu'attali and bring Kadesh under Egyptian control. But the Hittites were ready. Thanks to a network of spies and scouts, Mu'attali had advance warning of the Egyptian attack. He fortified Kadesh and waited, amassing 40,000 troops to meet the challenge. A massive clash was inevitable. Ramesses made a critical error. He split his forces, hoping to lure the Hittites into open combat. But Mu'attali didn't take the bait. Instead, as Ramesses' second division crossed near the Orontes River, the Hittites ambushed them, nearly routing the Egyptian army. Despite the chaos, Ramesses personally led a counterattack, rallying his troops and preventing a complete disaster. But the Egyptian forces were too scattered, and the Hittites missed their chance to finish the job. For reasons still debated by historians, Mu'attali chose not to pursue the Egyptians, and the battle ended in a stalemate. Though inconclusive, the Battle of Kadesh became one of the most famous military engagements of the ancient world, and out of its ashes came something unprecedented: peace. Years later, after the death of Mu'attali, the Hittite throne passed to Hattusili III. In 1258 BCE, he and Ramesses II made history by signing the world's first known peace treaty, a document inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. It read in part, "Ramesses the Great, king of Egypt, shall not attack the land of Hatti to seize any of its territory, and Hattusili, the great king of Hatti, shall not attack the land of Egypt to seize any of its territory." The treaty marked the beginning of a new era, not of war, but of friendship. The Hittites, renowned for their expertise in metalworking, shared their skills with the Egyptians, improving their weaponry and tools. In return, the Egyptians, masters of agriculture, offered techniques and knowledge that enhanced Hittite farming. Trade flourished. Both empires prospered. Peace had opened the door to progress. This remarkable period of cooperation endured until around 1200 BCE, when mysterious raiders known as the Sea Peoples launched devastating attacks across the eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire collapsed under the pressure, disappearing into the shadows of history. But the legacy of the world's first peace treaty would live on, a timeless reminder that even after war, peace is possible. On a distant continent, the first major civilization in the Americas was beginning to rise, what we now call the Olmec civilization, flourishing from around 1200 to 400 BCE in present-day Mexico, often referred to as the mother civilization of Native American cultures. The Olmecs remain shrouded in mystery. Much of what we know about them is speculative, largely because their hieroglyphic script has never been deciphered. One of the few enduring legacies they left behind are 17 colossal stone heads, massive sculptures believed to represent powerful rulers or warriors. In Mesoamerican belief systems, the head alone was thought to contain an individual's soul, emotions, and experiences. We may not know the names of these ancient leaders as we do Ramses or Hammurabi, but when we gaze into the carved stone faces, we can still feel their presence. In a way, they remain immortal, preserved in stone, waiting for their full story to be told. Meanwhile, in the east, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, was coming into its own. The Zhou rose to power following the decline of the Shang dynasty, which had failed to maintain the mandate of heaven, a concept that would define Chinese rule for centuries. This belief system introduced 4 foundational principles. First, heaven grants the emperor the right to rule. Second, since there is only one heaven, there can only be one legitimate emperor at a time. Third, the emperor's virtue determines his right to rule. And fourth, no dynasty holds power forever. When rulers lost virtue, they lost heaven's favor. Droughts, floods, famines, and earthquakes were seen as signs of divine displeasure. This was how the Shang fell, and how the Zhou rose. The Zhou also introduced a new political structure, feudalism. It was a straightforward but rigid system, resulting in a familiar social hierarchy. At the bottom were the peasants, bound to the land and tasked with producing food. Above them were the soldiers, defenders of the realm. Then came the lords, who taxed the peasants and passed a share of their tribute up to the king. At the top sat the king himself, wealthy and powerful thanks to the work of those below. In this system, the masses labored, and the elite prospered. But why did so many accept a life of endless toil? There were two main reasons. First, necessity. Ancient societies required large populations to sustain themselves. Second, philosophy. Near the end of the Zhou era, Chinese thought began to evolve. One man, Confucius, developed a system of ethics called Confucianism, which emphasized respect, loyalty, and personal responsibility. Central to this philosophy was the concept of li, a set of rituals, manners, and customs that preserved order in society. At the same time, another thinker, Laozi, introduced Taoism. Taoism, or the Way, encouraged individuals to live in harmony with the natural flow of the universe. It advised people to let go of worldly concerns, embrace simplicity, and focus on inner peace. Perfect advice for farmers burdened with daily struggle. The Taoist concept of yin and yang, light and dark, hot and cold, masculine and feminine, taught that balance between opposites was the key to a harmonious life. Together, Confucianism and Taoism offered a spiritual framework that made the hardships of ancient Chinese life more bearable. Meanwhile, far to the west, the Greek city-states were growing. By around 800 BCE, they had discovered an unpleasant truth. Their land was poor and infertile. To secure essential resources like grain, they needed to look beyond their borders. Colonization became a matter of survival. One of the most prolific colonizers was Miletus, a powerful city-state that established more than 90 colonies across Europe. At their height, the Greeks had colonies stretching from modern-day Marseille in France to the shores of southern Russia. These outposts became vital lifelines, feeding the growing Greek world. Among these new settlements, one would eventually rise to dominate them all: Rome. According to legend, the city was founded by twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Abandoned at birth, the brothers were placed in a basket and set adrift on the Tiber River. A she-wolf found them, nursed them, and raised them as her own. When the brothers grew up, they returned to the spot where they were saved, intending to build a city, but they quarreled over its name. The argument turned violent, and Romulus struck down his brother, naming the new city after himself. Thus, Rome was founded in 753 BCE, born of myth, blood, and ambition. While the Greeks were expanding outward, another great leader was preparing to reshape the world: Cyrus the Great. At the time, the Persians lived under the rule of the Median Empire. According to legend, when Cyrus was born, his grandfather, King Astyages, had a dream foretelling that the boy would one day overthrow him. To prevent this, the king ordered the infant killed. But the baby was secretly spared and raised by a shepherd. Years later, Astyages discovered the truth. Although the dream still haunted him, he allowed Cyrus to live, a decision he would come to regret. As a grown man, Cyrus led a revolt against the Medes. In 550 BCE, Astyages surrendered, fulfilling the prophecy. But Cyrus was only beginning. He conquered Babylon, seized control of Mesopotamia, and extended his rule as far as the Indus Valley. The world lay in his grasp. Cyrus also conquered Ionia, a Greek colony in Asia Minor, laying the foundations of what would become the vast Persian Empire. Upon his death, Cyrus passed the torch to another towering figure in history, Darius the Great. Back in Greece, city-states were gaining power, but two stood above the rest: Sparta and Athens. Sparta became synonymous with military might. From birth, Spartan life revolved around warfare. Newborns deemed weak or unfit were left to die. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and raised as warriors through brutal training regimens. Strength, discipline, and endurance were prized above all. Spartan society was divided into three main classes. At the top were aristocratic rulers who held political and military authority. Below them were free, non-citizen residents who served in the army but held no political power. At the bottom were the helots, an enslaved class who worked the land and sustained the state. Spartan life was harsh, disciplined, and militaristic. Every element of society, from politics to parenting, served the single goal of producing warriors. Sparta didn't just build an army, it became one. While their northern neighbors were just beginning to experiment with democracy, Athens had already developed a complex, some might say chaotic, system of governance. Athenian democracy consisted of two main institutions: the Council of 500 and the Assembly. The council was selected not through elections but randomly, via a method called sortition. Athens was divided into 10 tribes, each responsible for sending 50 citizens to the council every year. Eligible citizens received personalized tokens, which were placed into a device known as the claritarion. This lost contraption, involving tubes and colored balls, randomly selected 50 individuals from each tribe to serve on the council. Meanwhile, the assembly operated on a principle of universal citizen participation, though citizen was defined narrowly. You had to be male, not a slave, and either born in Athens or to Athenian parents. The Council of 500 prepared the agenda, but the assembly made the final decisions, often with over 30,000 citizens eligible to vote. To prevent total anarchy, 9 presidents were selected by lot on the morning of the assembly meeting, tasked with overseeing the process and maintaining order. Because they were chosen so last minute, bribing them was nearly impossible. Somehow, amidst the noise and disorder, the assembly voted, by shouting, for new laws, generals, and other civic measures. Yet not everyone saw this as a triumph of governance. The philosopher Plato, in Book 6 of the Republic, criticized the idea of putting power in the hands of the untrained. The true navigator must study the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, if he is really fit to control the ship. How could a randomly chosen citizen possibly understand justice, strategy, or philosophy? Plato envisioned a better solution: the philosopher king, a ruler devoted to wisdom, reason, and justice. He wrote, "There will be no end to the troubles of states till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call rulers truly and genuinely become philosophers." But here's the problem. Every ruler thinks they are the philosopher king. From Chinese emperors to Hittite warlords to Indian kings, they all believed their wisdom to be supreme. Not far from Greece, in the kingdom of Magadha, a young prince named Siddhartha Gautama was raised in unimaginable luxury. Sheltered from the outside world, Siddhartha lived in a palace filled with riches, pleasure, and perfection. But one day, he stepped beyond the palace walls, and what he saw changed everything. He encountered an old man, frail and dying. The sight shook him. For the first time, Siddhartha realized that life, in all its splendor, was also defined by suffering and mortality. As Gilgamesh had discovered long before, death was an inescapable part of being human. Determined to find answers, Siddhartha left behind his royal life and began a spiritual journey. He studied with mystics, fasted, and meditated for years. Then, beneath a fig tree, later known as the Bodhi tree, he reached enlightenment. Enlightenment was not a single moment, but an ongoing process, the release from ego and illusion and a connection to universal truth. From that day forward, Siddhartha became known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One. He spent the rest of his life teaching others how to reach that same state of clarity and inner peace. Back in Greece, trouble was brewing. After subduing the Ionian city-states, King Darius I of Persia set his sights on conquering mainland Greece. In 490 BCE, Darius launched an invasion and landed 20,000 men near the city of Marathon, just 26.2 miles from Athens. The Athenians, outnumbered with only 10,000 soldiers, responded with speed and strategy. Using their heavily armored hoplites, they struck the Persian flanks and then turned inward, surrounding and crushing the invaders. The result? 6,400 Persians dead to only 192 Athenians. A messenger named Pheidippides ran the 26.2 miles to Athens to announce the miraculous victory, forever etching the term marathon into history. But the Persians weren't finished. After Darius's mysterious death, his son Xerxes I prepared a massive invasion. In 480 BCE, he led over 100,000 men into Greece. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, Spartan King Leonidas and 7,000 Greek soldiers made their stand. Rather than wait, Leonidas launched a bold surprise attack on the Persian camp. Despite their heroism, the Spartans were surrounded and eventually defeated. Yet the tide turned at sea. At Salamis, the Greek general Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into narrow waters. In the ensuing chaos, the agile Greek ships destroyed much of Xerxes' navy. Though Xerxes returned to Persia, he left his general Mardonius behind to finish the conquest. In 479 BCE, the Persians marched to Plataea, where the Greeks had united. Over 30 city-states fielded a combined force of 110,000 hoplites against a 150,000-man Persian army. Fighting uphill and in close formation, the Greek infantry once again proved superior. Mardonius was killed, and the Persians were defeated. The Battle of Plataea marked the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, and Persia's dream of conquering Greece. In the aftermath of war, Athens flourished. Freed from external threats, the city entered a golden age of culture, philosophy, and architecture. Towering above the city, the Parthenon was constructed to showcase Athens's power and sophistication. At the same time, theater became central to civic life. The city Dionysia festival brought playwrights like Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes to prominence, blending entertainment with reflections on war, politics, and the human condition. But peace wouldn't last. As Athens built an empire through the Delian League, Sparta formed a rival coalition, the Peloponnesian League. Tensions erupted in 434 BCE over control of the city of Corcyra. Battles like Sybota and Pylos followed, though a temporary truce was signed in 421 BCE. Athens launched a new campaign, this time in Sicily. At first, the expedition went well, but when their brilliant general Alcibiades was recalled to face criminal charges, Athens lost its leadership. Without Alcibiades, the mission faltered. Syracuse, fortified and reinforced by Spartan allies, resisted the siege. Disease spread, supplies dwindled, and the Athenian fleet was eventually annihilated. Thousands were killed, many more enslaved. Just over a decade later, Athens itself fell to Sparta. The legendary age of Greece was over. neither Athens nor Sparta would ever regain their former glory, leaving the door open for a new kind of leader. A ruler who would see himself not just as a king, but as the philosopher King Plato had once dreamed of. Meanwhile, far to the east, the ancient concept of the mandate of heaven had spoken. The Zhou dynasty's time was over. After ruling China for over 800 years, their grip had weakened, and by divine will, or perhaps political collapse, the empire splintered. This ushered in the chaotic and violent era known as the Warring States, lasting from 475 to 221 BCE. In this time of constant warfare and shifting alliances, a bold new philosophy emerged: legalism. Championed by Han Feizi, legalism taught that humans were naturally selfish and driven by personal gain. The only way to maintain order, he argued, was through a strict system of rewards and punishments applied without exception. Feizi believed society needed a strong ruler, one with absolute power over the law, the army, the economy, and the people, to ensure obedience and control. Deep in the heart of what is now southern Mexico, the Zapotec civilization began to rise, laying its foundations in the rugged highlands of the Oaxaca Valley. At the center stood Monte Alban, an impressive city built atop a mountaintop, offering a sweeping view of the surrounding land. From this lofty perch, a powerful elite governed a strict social hierarchy, with skilled artisans and hardworking farmers forming the backbone of society. The Zapotecs were pioneers of sustainable agriculture, mastering the cultivation of maize and other crops even in times of drought. They also created one of Mesoamerica's earliest writing systems, using glyphs and symbols to record language and ideas. Equally impressive was their dual calendar system, combining a 260-day ritual cycle with a 365-day solar calendar, an innovation that revealed their deep understanding of time and the cosmos. In 356 BCE, in the Macedonian capital of Pella, a child was born who would one day conquer the known world, Alexander the Great. The son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias, Alexander was destined for greatness. But his education may have been his greatest weapon. From a young age, he was tutored by none other than Aristotle, the father of logic and one of the most brilliant minds in history. Aristotle laid the groundwork for biology, ethics, and the scientific method, shaping not only Alexander's intellect, but the future of Western thought. In 336 BCE, after the assassination of King Philip II, his son Alexander ascended the throne at just 20 years old. Determined to secure his rule, he swiftly crushed a rebellion in the Greek city of Thebes. Marching his army over 240 miles in just 2 weeks, Alexander razed the city to the ground when it refused to surrender, killing 6,000 and selling the rest into slavery. The brutal message was clear: resistance was not an option. Terrified, the rest of Greece fell in line. With Greece under control, Alexander turned his sights east toward the mighty Persian Empire. In 333 BCE, at the Battle of Issus, he met King Darius III and dealt him a crushing defeat, forcing the Persian ruler to flee. Alexander then conquered key cities, including Tyre, which had resisted his siege for months. In 331 BCE, he faced Darius again at Gaugamela, near the Tigris River. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Alexander's brilliant tactics led to another decisive victory. Darius fled once more, and Alexander claimed Babylon, seizing control of Mesopotamia. His campaign continued into modern-day Iran and Afghanistan, and in 330 BCE, he captured the magnificent city of Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. But his ambition knew no bounds. Pushing further east, Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains into India. There, his exhausted army finally refused to march any farther. After years of conquest, the young king was forced to turn back, not by enemy armies but by the limits of human endurance. After Alexander's retreat from the Indian subcontinent, a powerful new force rose from the east, the Mauryan Empire. At its peak, it stretched across vast territories, covering much of modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and even parts of Afghanistan. But one of its greatest rulers, Ashoka the Great, paid a heavy price for his ambition. In 261 BCE, following the death of his parents, Ashoka launched a brutal campaign against the independent kingdom of Kalinga. The war was devastating. Over 100,000 people were killed, and the bloodshed left a deep scar on Ashoka's conscience. Haunted by the horrors he had unleashed, the emperor turned away from conquest and toward compassion, finding solace in the teachings of Buddha. Ashoka transformed his empire into a beacon of Buddhist philosophy and non-violence. He issued edicts carved into stone pillars and rocks across his realm, spreading messages of kindness, religious tolerance, and even advocating for the abolition of slavery. It was a dramatic shift in leadership, marked by moral awakening rather than military might, something rarely seen in the empires of the West. In the West, to die in battle was seen as the highest honor. Heroes were remembered, while farmers faded into obscurity. Yet Alexander the Great, one of history's most legendary warriors, died not on the battlefield, but in Babylon in 323 BCE at just 32 years old. His death marked the end of an extraordinary campaign, during which he had not only conquered vast lands, but also spread the seeds of Greek philosophy, science, and culture. Ideas first planted in his mind by his teacher Aristotle. But the empire Alexander built was too vast, too fragile, and too reliant on his presence. After his sudden death, his generals, known as the Diadochi, descended into fierce power struggles. None could agree on who should lead the empire. What followed was a period of chaos and civil war that tore the empire apart. Eventually, the remnants of Alexander's domain fractured into three major Hellenistic kingdoms. The Ptolemies took control of Egypt, where Ptolemy the First, one of Alexander's closest companions, ushered in an era of prosperity. Inspired by his mentor's legacy, Ptolemy founded the Great Library of Alexandria, a beacon of knowledge where scholars from across the world gathered to exchange ideas, helping to preserve and expand the works of thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. In the East, Seleucus I claimed the heart of Babylon, then a vibrant crossroads of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian cultures. While Babylon thrived as a multicultural hub, the Seleucid Empire leaned heavily into Greek ideals, language, and customs. The Seleucid Empire reached its zenith under Antiochus III the Great, who ruled from 223 to 187 BCE. At its height, his empire stretched from modern-day Turkey to Pakistan, becoming one of the largest empires in history, second only to the mighty Romans, who would soon rise in the West. While the Ptolemies and Seleucids forged powerful kingdoms abroad, the Antigonids struggled to keep Macedon and Greece united. By the time Antigonus I rose to power, Greece was a shadow of its former greatness. The days of Socrates, Pericles, and democratic Athens were gone, replaced by fractured city-states and waning influence. For Rome to claim dominance over the Mediterranean, it had to confront a mighty rival, Carthage. Both powers coveted Messina, a strategic city-state on the island of Sicily. Whoever controlled it would control the central trade routes and the future of the region, This territorial clash ignited the First Punic War, which dragged on for over 2 decades. In 241 BCE, Rome emerged victorious. The Treaty of Lutatius was signed, forcing Carthage to retreat, but peace would not last. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began with a daring move. Hannibal, Carthage's brilliant general, led his troops and war elephants across the Alps into Italy. He delivered crushing defeats to the Romans, most notably at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, one of the worst losses in Roman history. But Rome endured. In 202 BCE, Scipio Africanus led a counterattack deep into Africa, defeating Hannibal at the decisive Battle of Zama. Carthage was forced to surrender and give up its territories, effectively ending its status as a major power. The Western Mediterranean now had a new master, Rome, and its ascent was unstoppable. While Rome expanded westward, a different kind of empire was rising in the east. After centuries of chaos during the Warring States period, Qin Shi Huang emerged as China's first true emperor, founding the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE. His rule was short, just 15 years, but transformative. Determined to unify the fragmented states of China, Qin reorganized the land into 36 commanderies, each overseen by a civil governor, a military commander, and an imperial inspector, a structure designed to keep local power in check and absolute control at the center. Under Qin, legalism flourished, a philosophy that viewed people as inherently selfish, requiring strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain order. Obedience was mandatory, disobedience meant ruin. But the dynasty's grip proved too brittle. After Qin Shi Huang's death, rebellion swept the empire. Out of the ashes rose a former peasant-turned-rebel, Liu Bang, who in 206 BCE established the Han dynasty. Unlike the Qin, the Han embraced Confucianism, a philosophy centered on virtue, moderation, and respect. These ideals wove a stronger, more stable political fabric, and the Han era became one of China's most revered golden ages. Silk production boomed, fueling not just the domestic economy but also a new global curiosity. In 138 BCE, Emperor Han Wudi sent envoys westward in search of foreign alliances and markets. This laid the groundwork for what would become the Silk Road. Though initially limited in scope, this network would eventually stretch all the way to the Mediterranean. One such envoy, Gan Ying, was dispatched in 97 BCE to reach Rome, but never made it. Upon reaching Mesopotamia, the Parthians, rulers of Iran at the time, deliberately misled him, claiming the journey to Rome would take years by sea. In truth, the route was much shorter, but the Parthians wanted to maintain their monopoly as middlemen in the lucrative trade between East and West. Thus, by the end of the 1st century BCE, the world had quietly settled into 3 vast spheres of influence: Rome in the west, Parthia in the center, and Han China in the east. Though separated by distance and language, these empires were now economically and indirectly connected by silk, ambition, and the invisible threads of global history. By 86 BCE, weakened by centuries of conflict, Greece faced a new and final conqueror: Rome. The Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched on Athens, laying siege to the city for months. Starvation, brutality, and fear spread within the walls. When the city finally fell, Sulla unleashed his legions, pillaging the city and destroying irreplaceable cultural treasures. With Athens in ruins, the center of power in the ancient world had clearly shifted, from Greece to Rome. Rome's ambitions didn't stop there. In 63 BCE, General Pompey was sent east to Judea, where he swiftly captured Jerusalem and brought the region of Galilee under Roman rule. including a small village called Nazareth. Rome was no longer just an empire. It was becoming the new axis of civilization. Rome's hunger for expansion was far from over. In 58 BCE, Julius Caesar became governor of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and was tasked with conquering the rest of Gaul, a region inhabited by Celtic tribes spread across modern-day France, Belgium, Switzerland, and parts of Germany and Italy. In 52 BCE, Caesar's forces clashed with the united Gallic tribes led by Vercingetorix, who made a last stand at Alesia. The fortified town was surrounded by hills, walls, and trenches. Rather than attack directly, Caesar built a massive siege system, one wall to trap the defenders, and a second, outward-facing wall to repel reinforcements. For weeks, both sides suffered. The Gallic warriors attempted multiple breakouts but were beaten back. Then, a second Gallic force led by Commius arrived to lift the siege, but Caesar's legions intercepted and defeated them. With no hope left, Vercingetorix surrendered to Caesar, walking out of Alesia and offering himself as a prisoner. Over the next 2 years, Caesar completed the conquest of Gaul. The Celtic tribes were absorbed into the Roman Empire. Many even granted citizenship, and Gaul became one of Rome's richest provinces. Despite his triumphs in Gaul, Julius Caesar's rising power alarmed the Roman Senate. His popularity with the people and growing control over the army made him a threat to the Republic. The Senate ordered him to step down and disband his army, or be declared an enemy of the state. Caesar now faced a fateful decision: obey the Senate, or defy them and risk civil war. Roman law forbade any general from bringing troops across the Rubicon River into Italy without Senate approval. Crossing it would be treason and a declaration of war. In 49 BCE, Caesar chose defiance. He crossed the Rubicon and uttered the legendary words, "Alea iacta est." The die is cast. What followed was a brutal civil war. Caesar quickly defeated opposition at Corfinium and later at Pharsalus, where he crushed the forces of his rival and former ally, Pompey, his own son-in-law. The decisive battle came in Spain near Ilerda, where, despite being outnumbered, Caesar's tactics prevailed. The Republic was his. When Caesar returned to Rome, the crowds hailed him as a hero. "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!" He was declared dictator for life and immediately began reforming the Republic. He commissioned roads, aqueducts, and bridges, expanded citizenship across the empire, and laid the foundation of Roman civil law. His influence stretched into culture. He promoted the Latin language and even reformed time itself by introducing the Julian calendar, the basis of our calendar today. But his reign was short. In 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated by senators Cassius and Brutus, who feared his growing power. His death plunged Rome into chaos, with no clear leader to fill the void. In the aftermath of Caesar's death, his 18-year-old adopted son, Octavian, returned to Rome to claim his inheritance. Clever and ambitious, he allied with Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general. Together, they avenged Caesar's murder by defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. But unity didn't last. As tensions grew, Octavian and Antony became rivals. In 31 BCE, their forces met in the decisive Battle of Actium, a massive naval clash. Octavian emerged victorious, while Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, the following year, they took their own lives. With his enemies gone, Octavian stood alone at the top. In 27 BCE, he was granted the title Augustus, becoming Rome's first emperor. The Republic had ended. The empire had begun. During the reign of Augustus, in the Roman-occupied town of Bethlehem, a child was born who would change the course of history: Jesus Christ. According to the Gospel of Luke, Augustus had issued a decree for a census across the empire, an essential tool for taxation and control. This decree required every man to return to his ancestral city. So Mary, pregnant with Jesus, and her betrothed Joseph made the grueling 90-mile journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. The city, crowded with descendants of King David, offered them no shelter. With no room in the inn, Mary gave birth in a stable, surrounded not by royalty but by animals and dust. In time, this child would be called King of the Jews. After the census, the family returned to Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. As he reached adulthood, stories of his teachings and miracles began to spread. His followers claimed he could heal the blind, multiply fish, and even raise the dead. They believed he was the Messiah, the Son of God. His disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, later recorded his life in the Gospels, four narrative accounts that form the foundation of Christian scripture. The story of a child born in obscurity became the most influential narrative in human history. But not all viewed Jesus as a savior. Under the rule of Emperor Tiberius, 14 to 37 CE, the Roman state relied on delators, informants who reported political threats. Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, was no stranger to harsh punishments. As Jesus gained followers, Roman authorities saw him as a threat to order. Following the Roman legal system and pressured by political unrest, Pilate authorized the crucifixion of Jesus. In that moment of death, a new religion was born: Christianity. Initially a small sect within Judaism, it would soon spread far beyond Judea, growing into one of the most powerful belief systems the world had ever known. One of the key figures in spreading Christianity across the Roman world was Paul of Tarsus. From Greece to Turkey to Syria, Paul traveled relentlessly, preaching the message of Jesus Christ. His missionary journeys are chronicled in the New Testament in the book of Acts. As he gained more followers, Paul also attracted enemies. The contrast between monotheistic Christianity and the polytheistic traditions of Rome became increasingly difficult to ignore. Romans struggled to accept a growing religious movement that rejected their gods, Jupiter, Mars, and the rest of the Roman pantheon. Tensions reached a breaking point in 64 AD, when a massive fire devastated Rome, destroying nearly 70% of the city. In search of a scapegoat, Emperor Nero blamed the Christians, launching the empire's first major persecution against them. To pay for reconstruction, Nero imposed heavy tributes across the empire and began minting more coins, leading to early inflation, a financial strain felt especially in provinces far from Rome. In 66 AD, anger erupted in Jerusalem, a city already on edge. The first Jewish revolt began with surprising success. Jewish rebels drove out the Roman garrison and gained control of nearby towns in Galilee. In response, Nero sent General Vespasian, who launched a calculated campaign to crush the uprising. By the time Vespasian was proclaimed emperor in 69 AD, most rebels had retreated into Jerusalem. In 70 AD, during Passover, Roman forces laid siege to the city. Starvation spread within the walls. Infighting among Jewish factions further weakened their defense. By August, Roman troops breached Jerusalem, massacred much of the population, and destroyed the Second Temple, a blow that would forever alter Jewish identity. The city was left in ruins. Christianity, still in its infancy, was now viewed with suspicion. But while the Romans fought to preserve their polytheistic order, the seeds of monotheism had already been planted, and they would not stop growing. From 98 to 117 AD, under the rule of Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Britain in the northwest to the Persian Gulf in the east. Roman authority dominated much of the known world. Well, almost. The Romans had no idea the Americas even existed. While Rome was conquering continents, civilizations in the Andes Mountains, in present-day Peru and Chile, were thriving in complete isolation. In the north, the Moche civilization built monumental structures like Huaca del Sol and Huaca de la Luna, massive pyramids that served as religious and political centers. They also developed advanced agricultural techniques, including the use of guano, bird droppings, as fertilizer, making their desert homeland fertile and productive. The Moche had a highly centralized government, where everyone had a defined role in society. Further south, the Nazca civilization emerged, shrouded in mystery to this day. The Nazca lines, massive geoglyphs etched into the desert, depict animals, geometric shapes, and human figures. Created by removing the top layer of dark rock to reveal lighter sand beneath, the purpose of these lines remains unknown. Some believe they were astronomical guides. Others propose religious rituals, or even alien contact. Whatever the truth, they remain one of the world's greatest unsolved archaeological puzzles. Around 100 AD, the Zapotec people began developing their capital city, Monte Alban. Located in the highlands of Oaxaca, it became one of the earliest examples of urban planning in the Americas. The city was laid out in a structured grid pattern, with main roads, side streets, and organized districts serving residential, administrative, and religious functions. Monte Alban wasn't just a ceremonial center, it was a functioning metropolis. And remarkably, it remained continuously occupied for over 1,000 years, leaving behind temples, observatories, and inscriptions that still speak to its complexity. After Trajan's death in 117 AD, the Roman Empire stood at its greatest size, but size brought instability. The new emperor, Hadrian, faced an enormous challenge: holding the empire together. Trouble was already brewing in the far reaches of Roman Britain. The native tribes resented Roman rule, much like the rebels in Judea before them. Fearing a major uprising, Hadrian acted decisively. He ordered the construction of a massive defensive wall, later known as Hadrian's Wall, stretching nearly coast to coast across northern Britain. More than just a barrier, it was a psychological message to the conquered. Rome was not leaving, but while one frontier was secured, another ignited. In Judea, a charismatic leader named Simon Bar Kokhba led a revolt against Rome's growing control. The final spark came when Hadrian began building a new Roman city, Aelia Capitolina, over the ruins of Jerusalem, complete with temples to Jupiter. To many Jews, it was a direct desecration of their faith. By 132 AD, Bar Kokhba had taken the title of Nasi, or head of state. Some hailed him as the Messiah, sent to restore Jewish independence. His forces attacked and nearly destroyed the Roman garrison in Aelia Capitolina. Hadrian responded with overwhelming force. He sent 120,000 Roman troops to crush the rebellion. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the results were catastrophic. 50 of their most important strongholds and 985 of their most famous villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were killed in the battles and raids, and the number who perished by famine, disease, and fire was beyond counting. Judea was left utterly desolate. Rome had spoken, and it made clear that rebellion would not be tolerated. The empire might bend at the edges, but it would not break. While the Roman Empire fought rebellions and unrest, China moved in a different direction. During the Han Dynasty, three powerful belief systems, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism, began to coexist and shape Chinese society. Rather than competing, these philosophies complemented each other, strengthening the moral and spiritual foundation of the Han Empire. Confucian order, Taoist balance, and Buddhist compassion helped forge a society rooted in unity, reflection, and resilience. Meanwhile, in Central America, Mayan architects transformed the lowlands of northern Petén into a landscape of sacred temples. Their structures featured wide staircases and were flanked by towering stucco masks, crafted from plaster and powdered limestone, molded into the faces of gods. These masks weren't decorative. They were designed to embody the divine, to bring the presence of the gods to earth. One remarkable example, known as Temple E7 Sub, features 16 massive deity masks carved into its sides. Through these faces, the Maya sought to connect the physical world with the spiritual, a stone canvas for eternal souls. In the Middle East, an ancient legacy was being revived. Around 224 AD, a Persian noble named Ardashir I claimed descent from Cyrus the Great. Dismissing the Parthians as illegitimate rulers, he rallied the fractured tribes of Persia under a single banner. At the Battle of Hormozgan, Ardashir's elite cavalry crushed the army of Parthian king Artabanus V, ending centuries of Parthian rule. Ardashir proclaimed himself Shahenshah, King of Kings, and founded the Sasanian Empire. He re-established Zoroastrianism as the state religion and built a powerful central government, with his new capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River. Under Ardashir, the Sasanian Empire became a rising power, rooted in Persian tradition, fueled by military strength, and prepared to challenge both Rome and the world beyond. While the Parthians were fading from history, the Han dynasty in China was nearing its own collapse. A once powerful empire began to unravel under the weight of political instability, economic decline, external invasions, internal rebellions, and relentless power struggles. As central authority weakened, regional warlords seized control, fracturing the empire from within. The government's efforts to fix the economy failed to restore order. External pressures and uprisings only accelerated the fall. Eventually, the warlord Zhou Pi declared himself emperor and founded the Wei dynasty, bringing the Han dynasty to an official end. Meanwhile, back in Rome, Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305 AD, faced a critical problem. The empire had become too vast to govern effectively. To solve this, he introduced the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into 4 regions, each ruled by its own emperor. Within this system, there were 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior ones, Caesars. Diocletian appointed Maximian as his fellow Augustus, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus were named Caesars. But while the idea was meant to ensure stability, it ended up fueling rivalries. Each emperor had his own ambitions, and by 305 AD, tensions reached a boiling point. That year, both Diocletian and Maximian voluntarily stepped down. The following year, Constantius died, leaving a dangerous power vacuum. In response, Constantius's troops unilaterally declared his son Constantine as both Caesar and Augustus, bypassing the traditional system. Meanwhile, Maximian's son Maxentius believed he deserved to be Caesar instead of Valerius Severus, who had been appointed in his place. In 307 AD, Maxentius raised an army and forced Severus to surrender. A year later, in 308, Galerius named Licinius as a new Augustus, further escalating the power struggle. By then, the Western Roman world had effectively split. Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain, while Maxentius held Italy and North Africa. But Maxentius struggled to consolidate his rule, and faced growing unrest in Rome. To assert his power, he commissioned the construction of a new bridge across the Tiber River, later known as the Milvian Bridge. Constantine saw Maxentius as a threat and marched on Rome to face him. As their armies approached the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly had a vision: a blazing cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Some sources describe this as a dream, others as divine revelation. Either way, Constantine believed it was a sign that victory would come under the Christian symbol. He ordered his soldiers to paint the cross on their shields and banners, entering battle with new confidence and purpose. The confrontation was fierce and bloody. Maxentius's army was larger, but poorly coordinated. Constantine seized the moment, drove Maxentius's troops back toward the Tiber, and, in the chaos of retreat, Maxentius fell into the river and drowned. After his triumph, Constantine met Licinius in Mediolanum, modern Milan, to finalize political arrangements and issue the historic Edict of Milan. This decree gave Licinius control over the Eastern Empire, while Constantine held the West. More importantly, it granted religious tolerance to Christians and returned confiscated property to the Church. But the peace between the two emperors was short-lived. Licinius, still a devoted pagan, clashed with Constantine's growing Christian sympathies. Their rivalry culminated in a decisive battle near Chrysopolis in 324 AD. Constantine's military brilliance prevailed again. He drove the Eastern Roman army to the sea, killing or capturing most of their forces. Licinius was defeated and later executed. Now, Constantine stood as sole ruler of the Roman Empire. To mark his victory, he renamed the eastern capital Byzantium as Constantinople. The following year, in 325 AD, he convened the First Council of Nicaea, where over 300 bishops established the Nicene Creed, declaring that Jesus Christ was begotten, not made, and of one substance with the Father. Constantine would rule for over a decade more. Only on his deathbed, in 337 AD, did he finally receive baptism, formally embracing the Christian faith he had long championed. By 370 AD, a new and terrifying force emerged on the horizon: the Huns. This nomadic, warlike people were fierce masters of mounted combat and moved with terrifying speed. According to legend, Hun children were trained in horsemanship by the age of 3, and to harden them, some were even cut with swords to build resistance to pain. These were not people to be trifled with. That same year, the Huns crossed the Volga River, driven by bloodlust and conquest. Their first victims were the Alans, who stood little chance against the Huns' cavalry assaults. 2 years later, in 372, the Huns turned their attention to the Ostrogoths, the eastern branch of the Gothic peoples, who had long plagued the Roman frontier with raids and incursions. By 376, the Huns had also struck the Visigoths, their western cousins, pushing them to the brink of destruction. In desperation, the Visigoths sought refuge within the borders of the Roman Empire. As the Huns overran Gothic territories, they quickly earned a reputation as the new barbarians of Europe, fierce, fast, and seemingly unstoppable. By 395 AD, their raids had begun to penetrate deep into Roman lands, and many Roman Christians saw them not as mere invaders but as devils sent straight from hell. The next wave of invasion came in the wake of the death of Theodosius the Great. His most notable legacy as emperor was his success in keeping the Goths and Huns at bay. But upon his death in 395 AD, Theodosius followed in the footsteps of Diocletian and divided the empire once more, splitting control between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This act made Theodosius the last emperor of a united Roman Empire. Under the rule of Honorius, The Western Roman Empire quickly began to deteriorate. Inexperienced and politically weak, Honorius failed to command the respect or effectiveness of his predecessors, turning Western Rome into an easy target. The Visigoths, seeking new lands to settle, turned their gaze toward the heart of the empire. Throughout the early 400s and 10s, they ravaged several Roman cities, exploiting the empire's vulnerability. Then, on August 24th, 410 AD, history was made. The Visigoths, under King Alaric, sacked the city of Rome, a city that had stood unconquered by foreign hands for nearly 800 years. Though they took the city, the Visigoths could not hold it. Instead, they continued pillaging across Roman territories until they eventually founded their own kingdom in 418 AD, in what is now modern-day Spain. Life in the Eastern Roman Empire was hardly more secure. A new threat was on the rise: the infamous Attila the Hun, whose ruthless campaigns earned him the chilling title, the Scourge of God. After a failed peace negotiation in 441 AD, Attila unleashed his forces across the Balkans and the Danube frontier, laying waste to cities and villages. Though another treaty was signed in 442, it didn't last. Just a year later, in 443, Attila broke the agreement and once again rampaged through Roman territory, pillaging his way toward the fortified walls of Constantinople. But the eastern capital's massive walls held firm. Attila couldn't breach them, and instead agreed to a new peace deal. In exchange for leaving Constantinople untouched, he demanded a staggering annual tribute, 2,100 pounds of gold. By 451 AD, the Huns turned west and invaded Gaul. Their aggression forced two former enemies, the Visigoths and the Romans, to set aside their differences and unite against a common foe. According to legend, the night before battle, Attila performed a ritual with sacrificial bones and foresaw the death of thousands of his warriors. The omen proved true. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, after hours of brutal combat, tens of thousands lay dead, and Attila suffered his first and only major defeat. Yet, even this did not stop him. In 452, Attila returned, this time marching into Italy, burning cities as he advanced toward Rome. But before he reached the capital, he encountered Pope Leo I, who came as a diplomatic envoy. No records remain of what was said. But legend tells that the spirits of St. Peter and St. Paul appeared to Attila and threatened him with death if he did not heed the Pope's words. Whether it was fear of divine wrath, the Pope's persuasion, or the exhaustion and illness within his army, Attila turned back, retreating to the great Hungarian plain. But Rome's troubles were far from over. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was crumbling. The young emperor Romulus Augustulus sat on a fragile throne, widely viewed as illegitimate and powerless. The Eastern Roman Empire sent the Germanic general Odoacer to suppress a rebellion within the Roman army. But instead of restoring order, Odoacer seized the moment. He turned against the imperial government and deposed Romulus Augustulus, bringing the Western Roman Empire to its official end. Odoacer declared himself King of Italy, marking a new chapter in the peninsula's history. But his rule didn't last long. In 493, Theodoric the Great, leader of the Ostrogoths, invaded Italy with the backing of Eastern Emperor Zeno. Theodoric defeated Odoacer and founded the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy, sending his rival to meet a grim fate. While Europe descended into the shadows of the early medieval period, India, under the Gupta Empire, was experiencing a mathematical golden age. Brilliant scholars like Brahmagupta revolutionized mathematics by introducing zero, not just as a symbol, but as a true placeholder, essential to solving complex equations. Meanwhile, the renowned astronomer Aryabhata made groundbreaking strides. He accurately calculated the circumference of the Earth, demonstrating that the world was round, long before this idea gained global acceptance. Aryabhata also developed advanced methods for calculating pi and square roots, but perhaps his most remarkable contribution was the concept of the asymptote, a line that approaches a curve but never quite touches it, laying the foundations for future developments in calculus centuries ahead of its time. In Western Europe, the Franks, led by Clovis I, were locked in rising tension with the Alemanni, another Germanic tribe. By 496 AD, the conflict erupted into the Battle of Tolbiac, as both sides fought fiercely for dominance in the region. During the battle, as the Alemanni began to overwhelm the Franks, Clovis found himself in a moment of desperation. He called out to the Christian god, vowing to convert to Christianity if granted victory. According to legend, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in, giving the Franks the chance to regroup. They launched a renewed assault and achieved a decisive victory. Clovis kept his promise. He converted to Christianity, and in doing so, brought the faith to the forefront of Frankish life, laying the foundation of the Frankish kingdom and its deep-rooted Christian identity. Although the Western Roman Empire had collapsed, the eastern half, centered in Constantinople, was transforming. Some historians debate whether the Byzantine Empire was a continuation of Rome, but under Justinian I, there's no denying it carried forward Rome's imperial legacy into a new era. Like many emperors before him, Justinian pursued expansionist campaigns, reclaiming lost Roman territories across Italy, North Africa, and even parts of Spain, briefly reviving the imperial dream in the Mediterranean. But Justinian's legacy wasn't only military. He assembled a team of scholars to codify centuries of Roman law into a unified legal system, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental work that would shape European legal traditions for centuries. He also commissioned one of the most iconic buildings of the ancient world, the Hagia Sophia. Adorned with intricate mosaics and marble, it stood not only as a triumph of architecture but as the spiritual heart of the Eastern Orthodox Church. But Jesus wasn't the only prophet whose legacy would shape the world. In the trading city of Mecca, a man was born into the Quraysh tribe who would forever transform the religious and political map of the Middle East, Muhammad. Orphaned at a young age, Muhammad was raised first by his grandfather and later by his uncle. As he grew up, he became a respected merchant, known throughout Mecca by the title Al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy. In 610 AD, while meditating in a cave on Mount Jabal al-Nur, Muhammad received a divine revelation. The angel Gabriel appeared to him and delivered a message from God: "Recite in the name of your Lord who creates man from a clot. Recite, for your Lord is most generous." These words became the opening verses of Surah 96 in the Quran. At first, Muhammad hesitated, unsure how to share this message. But he soon began to attract a small group of followers. The pagan leaders of Mecca mocked and resisted him. But when Muhammad openly denounced idol worship, opposition grew fierce. Eventually, facing rising hostility, Muhammad and his followers undertook the Hijra, migrating 260 miles north to Medina. There, Muhammad helped end bloody tribal feuds and laid the foundations for a prosperous Muslim community. But peace didn't last. The Quraysh, along with allied tribes, marched on Medina with a large army. In response, Muhammad devised a strategy. A trench was dug around the city, a tactic unfamiliar to Arabian warfare, making direct assault nearly impossible. After weeks of failed attempts, the Quraysh siege collapsed under heavy rain and wind. The Muslims emerged victorious. In 630 AD, Muhammad returned to Mecca, this time with an army. The city surrendered with little resistance. Instead of revenge, Muhammad offered amnesty to his former enemies, and most of Mecca embraced Islam. By the time of Muhammad's death, nearly all of Arabia had unified under Islam. Afterward, a series of leaders known as caliphs took charge of the growing Muslim community, beginning with Abu Bakr, one of Muhammad's closest companions. Under the caliphs, Islamic expansion accelerated. Abu Bakr first targeted the Byzantine provinces of Syria, seizing key cities like Damascus and Jerusalem. Then, in 636 AD, Arab armies invaded the Sassanid Empire, capturing their capital in 637 and bringing an end to centuries of Persian rule. From there, they moved west into Egypt, where after prolonged battles, they took Alexandria in 642 AD, striking a major blow to Byzantine economic and military power. By 716, Muslim forces had conquered North Africa, Carthage, and most of the Iberian Peninsula, forging an empire that stretched from Lisbon to the borders of China. From their stronghold in Spain, Arab armies launched raids into Francia, modern-day France. In 732 AD, they mounted a major invasion, led by Emir Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. His forces quickly captured Bordeaux and approached the city of Tours, but waiting for them was Charles Martel, the powerful leader of the Franks. He rallied a massive army to confront the invaders in what would become a defining clash, the Battle of Tours, often framed as Christianity versus Islam. Both sides were determined to defend their faiths and empires. The battle, fought on October 10, 732 AD, was long and brutal. Both armies suffered heavy losses. In the end, Charles Martel's forces prevailed, and the Arab army was forced to retreat back to Spain, effectively halting the northern expansion of the Islamic Empire into Europe. While in the West, the age was marked by warfare and religious conflict, Tang Dynasty China offered a stark contrast. Under Tang rule, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted in relative harmony. Citizens were free to follow their own spiritual paths, which led to the construction of countless temples and pagodas across the empire. This period wasn't just one of tolerance, it was a golden age of culture. During the Tang era, Chinese poetry flourished like never before. Poets such as Li Bai, Li Po, and Du Fu penned verses that would become the foundation of classical Chinese literature. One of Li Bai's most famous works, Zazen on the Qingting Mountain, translated by Sam Hamill, captured the serene beauty of contemplation. The birds have vanished down the sky. Now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains. In 768, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, rose to power as king of the Franks. A brilliant military strategist, he led a series of successful campaigns that expanded his empire across much of Western Europe, including modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and parts of Spain. But Charlemagne's ambition was not limited to conquest. He was a devout Christian who saw his rule as a divine mission. He worked tirelessly to spread Christianity across his empire, often by force, but also through alliances, education, and church reform. Charlemagne would go on to lay the foundations of what would later be known as the Holy Roman Empire, and become one of the most influential rulers of the early medieval world. In 785, a different kind of ruler emerged in the Islamic world. Harun al-Rashid was declared caliph, and unlike many of his predecessors, he turned his focus inward, not on war, but on knowledge. He established the House of Wisdom in the heart of Baghdad, a grand library and research institution that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. There, they translated ancient texts and advanced fields such as algebra, chemistry, sociology, and even explored the abstract idea of infinity. Under Harun's reign, Baghdad became the intellectual capital of the world, and the Islamic Golden Age reached its peak. But not all civilizations sought knowledge or peace. In 793 AD, a violent new force surged onto the European scene: the Vikings, pagan seafarers from Scandinavia in search of wealth and plunder. On June 8th, a Viking raiding party, likely from Norway or Denmark, landed on the island of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. This small isolated island was home to a revered Christian monastery, one of the most important centers of learning in Europe. The Vikings stormed the island, pillaging the monastery, killing monks, and taking others as slaves. The raid was swift and brutal, and it sent shockwaves across the Christian world. The Viking Age had begun, and Europe would never be the same. In 799 AD, turmoil shook the Christian world. Pope Leo III was attacked in Rome by political enemies who accused him of tyranny and serious misconduct. Fearing for his life, the Pope fled to the Frankish kingdom, seeking help from its most powerful ally, Charlemagne. Charlemagne responded swiftly. He and his Frankish army escorted the Pope back to Rome, re-establishing him in his office and asserting Frankish influence over papal affairs. But the event raised a pressing question throughout Christendom. Was the Pope's power still legitimate? To solidify the alliance between church and crown, Charlemagne returned to Rome in late 800 AD. There, on Christmas Day, inside the Basilica of St. Peter, Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Romans, reviving the imperial tradition in the West. This act marked the birth of what would be known as the Holy Roman Empire, or at least its first incarnation, with Charlemagne as its founding figure. Under his reign, the foundations of a powerful Christian empire were laid. But after Charlemagne's death in 814, the empire faced deepening internal troubles. Charlemagne's only surviving son, Louis the Pious, 788 to 840, inherited the empire, but not his father's strength. Though devout and well-meaning, Louis was perceived as weak and indecisive, and his reign was plagued by unrest. Meanwhile, external threats grew ever more dangerous. Viking raiders, descending from the north, relentlessly attacked the empire's river cities, striking Cologne, Trier, Mainz, and many more. Monasteries were pillaged, religious relics destroyed, and fear spread throughout the realm. Confidence in the central government crumbled. If the emperor could not protect the people, why should they trust him? Local nobles began taking matters into their own hands, building fortresses, raising militias, and offering protection in exchange for loyalty. In time, ordinary people surrendered their freedom to these lords, working the land in return for security. Thus began the emergence of a new social structure: feudalism. Much like in medieval China, centralized power gave way to a hierarchy of local rule, with land, not imperial authority, becoming the foundation of power. While the Holy Roman Empire struggled with northern raids, the Byzantine Empire in the east faced a different enemy: the Arabs. In 820 AD, Arab raiders launched an invasion of Crete, a strategically vital island in the eastern Mediterranean. After several years of fighting, they overcame Byzantine resistance. By 827, Crete was absorbed into the Arab Empire, becoming a base for future raids across the region. That same year, Arab forces landed a large fleet on Sicily. City after city fell under their control. A year later, in 828, the neighboring island of Sardinia also succumbed. The loss of these islands marked a major blow to Byzantine naval dominance and extended the Arab Empire's influence deeper into the Mediterranean, establishing a permanent presence that would challenge Christian powers for generations. After the death of Louis the Pious in 840 AD, the empire of Charlemagne began to unravel. Power struggles erupted among his heirs, and in 843, the conflict was settled by the Treaty of Verdun, which formally divided the Holy Roman Empire among three members of the Carolingian dynasty. In the west, Charlemagne's grandson, Charles the Bald, received what would become the West Frankish Kingdom, roughly modern-day France. In the east, Louis the German, another grandson, was granted the East Frankish Kingdom, centered in what is now Germany. The central portion, the Middle Kingdom, went to Charlemagne's eldest son Lothair. But squeezed between two ambitious brothers, the Middle Kingdom proved unstable and short-lived, soon dissolving into obscurity. The Vikings were not just plundering continental Europe, they had also turned their sights on England. By 871 AD, a new king rose in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, Alfred the Great, whose singular mission was to protect his people. Alfred devised a network of fortified towns, known as burhs, which provided safe havens against Viking raids. He also introduced new military strategies and built alliances with neighboring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, laying the groundwork for a united England. Unlike in Britain, where Vikings arrived as invaders, in Eastern Europe they were welcomed. According to legend, the Slavic tribes of what is now Russia and Ukraine, weary of constant infighting, invited the Varangians, a Viking people, to bring order. In response, a Norse leader named Rurik arrived in Novgorod with his brothers. Using their famed discipline and strength, they established rule, and Rurik was declared king, founding the Kievan Rus dynasty. Under the military leadership of Oleg, one of Rurik's kinsmen, the Kievan Rus expanded, founding key cities such as Smolensk and Kiev, the roots of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Back in England, Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, rose to prominence. Building on his grandfather's network of alliances, he managed to unite the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to fend off Viking threats. In recognition of his success, Athelstan was declared the first king of all England, forging a monarchy that would become one of the longest-lasting in human history. Meanwhile, the East Frankish kingdom was battling a different enemy, the Magyars, pagan raiders from the east. Their attacks left the region in fear and disarray. But in 955 AD, King Otto I led his forces to victory at the Battle of Lechfeld, crushing the Magyar threat. Then, in 961, Otto completed his conquest of northern Italy, reclaiming it for Christendom. In recognition of his power and piety, Pope John XII crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in 962 AD, officially restoring the Holy Roman Empire, this time with a firm foundation in the east. While the East Frankish kingdom was gaining strength, the West Frankish kingdom, what would become France, was in decline. In 987 AD, King Louis V, the last direct male descendant of Charlemagne, died at just 20 years old without an heir. His sudden death threw the French monarchy into crisis. To prevent political collapse, the French nobility held an election to determine who should wear the crown. The two main candidates were Hugh Capet, a powerful noble with vast estates in the Île-de-France region, and Charles, Duke of Lower Lorraine, a Carolingian by blood. With the critical backing of Adalbero, Archbishop of Reims, Hugh Capet was chosen. His coronation marked a turning point, and the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, which would go on to rule France for more than 3 centuries. But across Europe, everyday life remained uncertain and often dangerous. Warfare was constant, borders shifted, and no one felt truly safe. Kingdoms had become obsessed with land and power, willing to fight endlessly to expand or defend their territory. In this atmosphere of chaos, a new social structure emerged: feudalism. It was both a survival mechanism and a political system, and it defined medieval Europe for centuries. At the bottom of the feudal pyramid were the serfs, peasants bound to the land, whose job was to farm and feed the population. Above them were the knights, who offered military protection. Then came the nobles, who controlled vast regions and ruled over local populations. Above them stood the kings, who granted land in exchange for loyalty and military service. But at the very top of this hierarchy stood the Pope, the spiritual leader of Christendom. As the only figure believed to speak directly with God, the Pope claimed divine authority over all earthly rulers and God-given ownership of all Christian lands. In the early 11th century, Leif Erikson set sail on a daring voyage to explore lands west of Greenland. If you glance at a modern map, you'll see what lay in that direction: the vast, uncharted Americas. Leif and his crew reached a mysterious new land they called Vinland, located in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. There, they spent the winter, establishing a small settlement and engaging in trade with the indigenous people. They explored the surrounding wilderness, finding it rich in resources, towering forests, abundant fish, and plentiful game. When spring arrived, Leif and his men returned to Greenland, hailed as heroes for discovering a new world. Unbeknownst to him, Leif Erikson had become the first known European to set foot on a new continent, centuries before Columbus. Although far less is known about the Americas during this period, many historians believe that similar patterns of expansion and development were unfolding across the continent, just as they were in Europe. Unfortunately, written records from this era in the Americas are scarce, leaving much of their story hidden in mystery. What we do know is that the Maya civilization in the south was thriving, building remarkable cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Chichen Itza, with an estimated population ranging from 2 to 10 million. In the north, various indigenous tribes, including the Cherokee, Navajo, and Inuit, were also establishing their own cultures and communities. It is most likely the Inuit who first encountered Leif Erikson and his Norse explorers. Meanwhile, in the holy city of Jerusalem stood one of Christianity's most revered landmarks, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. According to Christian tradition, it was built on the very site where Jesus was crucified and resurrected. But in the year 1009 AD, a dramatic blow was dealt to the Christian world. The Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim ordered the complete destruction of this sacred church, along with several other holy sites in the city. The devastation was total. Shrines that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. When word of the destruction reached Europe, it sent shockwaves through Christendom. Horrified by the news, Pope Sergius IV issued a circular letter to churches across Europe, calling for a holy struggle to reclaim the Holy Land and expel the Muslims from Jerusalem. But before Jerusalem ever fell, the Arabs of the Abbasid Caliphate were themselves overthrown by another rising power from the east. The Seljuk Turks, a Central Asian Turkic people who had embraced Islam, were rapidly expanding their empire. In 1055, they seized control of Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Though the Seljuks initially showed deference to the caliph, real power in the city soon shifted into their hands. By 1076, they had taken Medina, and just a year later they captured Mecca, the holiest city in all of Islam. Amid growing instability in the Muslim world, few were prepared for what came next. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II issued a powerful call to arms. All Christians were to unite and liberate the Holy Land from Muslim control. He promised spiritual rewards and the forgiveness of sins to those who took part. The message spread like wildfire across Europe. Knights, nobles, and even peasants were moved by faith, ambition, or the promise of redemption, and joined what became known as the First Crusade. Prominent European leaders such as Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Flanders led their armies on the long march toward Jerusalem. While the Crusaders were united in purpose, the Muslim world was fractured and disorganized, unable to mount an effective resistance. As a result, the Crusaders captured the county of Edessa in 1098, and, the following year, they seized the holy city of Jerusalem in 1099. But the Crusades were far from over. In 1144, Muslim forces led by the Turkish ruler Imad ad-Din Zengi laid siege to the city of Edessa. Poorly defended and isolated, the Crusader stronghold stood little chance. After several weeks of siege, the walls were breached. Zengi's forces stormed the city, killing or enslaving much of the population. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through Christendom. Determined to reclaim the lost territory, European powers launched the Second Crusade in 1147. Massive armies from across the continent, including those led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, marched once again to the Holy Land. However, the campaign was doomed from the start. Crusader forces faced severe logistical problems, including food shortages and poor coordination. Political infighting and rivalries among leaders further undermined the effort. The turning point came in 1149 at the disastrous Battle of Enab, where much of the Crusader army was destroyed, and King Louis VII was captured. The Second Crusade, like Edessa, ended in failure. While Christians and Muslims were locked in conflict over the Holy Land, a stunning achievement was rising in Southeast Asia. In the heart of the Khmer Empire, King Suryavarman II commissioned a magnificent temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, a structure now known as Angkor Wat. Vishnu, one of the principal deities in Hinduism, is revered as the preserver and protector of the universe. He is believed to have 10 earthly incarnations, or avatars, and is often depicted with blue skin, holding 4 symbolic objects. Approaching Angkor Wat, visitors are met with a vast moat and an imposing gateway, richly decorated with intricate carvings of mythological beings and divine figures. The central temple complex rises like a sacred mountain, crowned with soaring towers and covered in elaborate bas-reliefs. These carvings vividly portray epic tales from Hindu mythology, grand ceremonies, legendary battles, and everyday life in the Khmer Empire. At the heart of the complex stands the central sanctuary, a towering, pyramid-like shrine surrounded by smaller temples and courtyards. This inner sanctum, considered the holiest part of Angkor Wat, is adorned with beautifully carved statues and divine imagery. It remains one of the most remarkable architectural and spiritual achievements in human history. By 1187, the Muslim commander from Egypt, Saladin, had grown weary of Christian rule over Jerusalem. In response, he declared a holy war across the Muslim world, calling for the reconquest of the sacred city. The decisive battle took place on a scorching summer day in the hills near the Sea of Galilee. Saladin commanded an army of around 20,000, while the Crusaders, under the aptly named King Guy, had a much smaller force of approximately 12,000 knights, soldiers, and civilians. What began as minor skirmishes quickly escalated into a full-scale engagement. Using superior cavalry tactics, Saladin's forces encircled the Crusaders, who struggled to break through the Muslim lines. Under the brutal heat and suffering from thirst, the Crusader army became weakened and disoriented. Seizing the moment, Saladin launched a devastating assault, breaking through the Crusader ranks and capturing many knights. King Guy and a small contingent managed to escape, but the majority of the Crusader army was annihilated. This crushing defeat dealt a severe blow to Christian power in the region and cleared the path for Saladin to retake Jerusalem. But the Christian world wasn't about to let the Holy City go without a fight, and so another crusade began. This time, it was led by the three most powerful monarchs of the era: Emperor Frederick I of the Holy Roman Empire, King Richard I of England, and King Philip II of France. They mobilized their finest armies to reclaim Jerusalem. Yet, despite their might and determination, they were unable to wrest the city from Saladin's control, leaving the Third Crusade a failure. Genghis Khan was born into hardship. His mother had been kidnapped by his father and forced into marriage, a brutal beginning for a man who would later shape the course of history. Legend says he came into the world clutching a blood clot in his right hand, a symbol, some believed, of his destined power. Before he turned 10, Genghis lost his father to poisoning by a rival clan. In the aftermath, his own tribe abandoned him, his mother and his 6 siblings, unwilling to support them. But Genghis was not easily broken. As he grew older, he began forging alliances with other clans across the rugged Mongolian steppe. By 1206, he had done the impossible, uniting the many fractured tribes into a single force, bringing together nearly 1 million people under his leadership. Remarkably, for his time, Genghis introduced progressive reforms. He outlawed the kidnapping and sale of women, banned the enslavement of Mongols, and granted freedom of religion across his empire. Yet in war, Genghis Khan was ruthless. His first major campaign came in 1209 against the Xixia kingdom. His cavalry-based army, highly mobile and disciplined, quickly overwhelmed and destroyed it. Next, he turned his sights on the powerful Jin dynasty in northern China. From 1211 to 1214, the Mongols ravaged the countryside, triggering massive food shortages. In desperation, Jin officials slaughtered tens of thousands of their own peasants to conserve resources for the elite. In 1214, the Mongols laid siege to the Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, and burned it to the ground. In the early 13th century, King John of England found himself under immense pressure from his barons, who were demanding greater rights and legal protections. To avoid open rebellion, John agreed to meet with them and negotiate. The result was one of the most significant legal documents in history, the Magna Carta. Signed in 1215, the Magna Carta outlined a series of rights and freedoms that even the king could not violate. Among them were the right to a fair trial, the right to due process of law, and protection from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. It also enshrined the principle of habeas corpus, the idea that no person could be imprisoned without being formally charged and brought before a court. Though originally intended to resolve a political crisis, the Magna Carta laid the foundation for legal systems around the world. Just 2 years later, in 1217, another crusade was launched, this time led by King Andrew II of Hungary and Duke Leopold VI of Austria. Once again, the goal was the same: to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The Crusaders began by capturing the Egyptian city of Damietta in 1219. However, their campaign stalled. They struggled to push further into Egypt and faced repeated setbacks, including the capture and imprisonment of many crusaders. Eventually, the Christian forces were forced to abandon their advance and agree to a treaty. They were allowed to leave Egypt unharmed, but without achieving their ultimate goal. The Fifth Crusade, like many before it, ended in disappointment. But Genghis Khan was far from finished. In 1219, he launched a brutal campaign against the Khwarezm Empire, a vast realm spanning present-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, and Iran. The Mongol hordes swept through one city after another, seizing Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, and more. Skilled workers, such as carpenters, jewelers, and artisans, were often spared. But aristocrats and soldiers who resisted were executed. Unskilled captives were sometimes forced into horrifying roles, used as human shields in future sieges. No one knows exactly how many perished during Genghis Khan's conquests, partly because the Mongols deliberately exaggerated their brutality to strike fear into all who opposed them. By the time of Genghis Khan's death, his empire stretched from the Sea of Japan to the Caspian Sea, the largest contiguous empire in history. And even more astonishing, today, roughly 8% of men in South Asia are believed to be direct descendants of Genghis Khan. In 1228, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire launched the Sixth Crusade in a renewed attempt to reclaim the Holy Land. But despite political maneuvering and temporary truces, the campaign ultimately failed. The crusade came to an end without significant territorial gains. Yet Europe wasn't finished. In 1248, King Louis IX of France embarked on the Seventh Crusade, determined to retake Jerusalem. But the campaign went disastrously wrong. Louis was captured by Muslim forces and had to pay a heavy ransom for his release. Undeterred, he launched yet another effort in 1270, the Eighth Crusade. This time, however, he never made it to Jerusalem. King Louis IX died of dysentery during the campaign, and with his death, the Crusader forces fell into disarray and withdrew. Thus ended the final major crusade, closing a long and bloody chapter in medieval history. In 1295, England was entering a new era of political development. Seeking broader support for his policies, King Edward I summoned what would become one of the earliest examples of a representative parliament. In his letter of summons, he wrote, "Since the most righteous law of the emperors ordains that what touches all should be approved by all, so it appears that common dangers should be met by remedies agreed upon in common." With that declaration, Edward requested a tenth of the incomes of nobles and an 11th from knights, effectively establishing a new model of governance. This marked a pivotal step toward modern parliamentary systems, and the idea of shared political responsibility in the face of national challenges. Meanwhile, in West Africa, a legendary figure was rising to global prominence: Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali. He is remembered not only for his extraordinary wealth, but also for the scale and symbolism of his journey to Mecca, the Hajj that every Muslim is expected to make at least once in their lifetime. Accompanied by a vast caravan of camels and an entourage of scholars, Mansa Musa handed out gold so freely to the poor along his route that it destabilized entire regional economies across North Africa due to rampant inflation. Upon returning to Mali, Mansa Musa devoted himself to turning Timbuktu into the intellectual and spiritual heart of the Muslim world. He invested heavily in the construction of the University of Sankor, attracting Islamic scholars from across the continent to study theology, law, and literature. At its peak, the university housed over 1 million manuscripts. Deeply devout, Mansa Musa also made it his policy to commission the construction of a new mosque every Friday. Sadly, only one of these great mosques, the Jinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu, has survived the passage of time. Across the ocean, in the Americas, yet another great civilization was rising, one built on legend, faith, and wealth. According to Aztec mythology, the god Huitzilopochtli commanded his people to settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. When the Aztecs witnessed this exact vision on a small island in Lake Texcoco, they believed it was a divine sign, and there they founded their capital, Tenochtitlan. Over time, Tenochtitlan grew into a marvel of engineering and religious devotion. Its crown jewel was the Great Temple, a massive stepped pyramid with 2 shrines at the top, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture. The city itself was extraordinary. Built atop a lake, it was laced with canals and connected by wide stone causeways, allowing for transportation, trade, and flood control. The Aztecs also mastered the art of chinampas, floating gardens built on the shallow lake beds, where they cultivated maize, beans, squash, and other staple crops. By the time the Spanish arrived, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest and most advanced cities in the world. While the Aztecs and Malians were building thriving cities, across the Atlantic, England and France were locked in one of the longest and most bitter conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. At the heart of the struggle was a question of legitimacy and land. One key issue was the status of the Duchy of Guyenne, a territory in France that was legally held by the English crown. While England claimed ownership, the land physically lay within France's borders, causing constant friction. Tensions worsened when the French king, Charles IV, the last direct male descendant of Charlemagne, died in 1328 without a son. The closest legitimate male heir was his nephew, Edward III of England, through his mother, Isabella of France. Edward laid claim to the French throne in 1337, a move that the French nobility rejected outright. And so, the war began. A conflict that would rage intermittently for over a century. As the erratic and seemingly endless 100 Years' War dragged on, another, far deadlier, threat emerged. In the mid-14th century, the world was struck by a pandemic of unimaginable scale, the bubonic plague. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio described the horror in vivid detail. At the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. Historians believe the disease spread via fleas carried by rats, traveling on merchant ships across Europe, and along trade routes such as the Silk Road. Wherever it went, it left devastation in its wake. Estimates vary, but between 75 and 200 million people are believed to have perished, wiping out as much as a third to half of Europe's population. The social consequences were just as profound as the death toll. With so many peasants and laborers dead, the balance of power began to shift. Landowners and nobles, desperate to maintain productivity, were forced to grant more freedoms and better conditions to surviving workers, laying early groundwork for improved labor rights in the centuries to come. While Europe was reeling from plague and war, a major transformation was taking place in the East. In China, dissatisfaction with Mongol rule under the Yuan dynasty was growing, and it soon erupted into full-scale rebellion. a group known as the Red Turbans, driven by a mix of Buddhist and millenarian beliefs, rose up in defiance. Among their leaders was a former peasant named Zhou Yuanzhang, who had grown up in poverty and hardship. Charismatic and strategically brilliant, Zhou quickly emerged as the movement's central figure. By 1368, Zhou had unified enough support to seize power. He declared himself emperor and founded the Ming dynasty, bringing Mongol rule to an end and ushering in a new era of Han Chinese leadership. Under his reign and those who followed, the Ming would go on to become one of the most prosperous and culturally rich dynasties in Chinese history. In 1428, at just 16 years old, Joan of Arc left her village of Domremy and traveled to the court of Charles VII, where she boldly asked for permission to lead the French army against the English. At first, her request was met with disbelief and skepticism, but Joan refused to back down and eventually gained the trust of French commanders. Her first major victory came in 1429, during the Siege of Orléans. She led a series of daring attacks that broke the siege and liberated the city, a turning point in the war. The triumph electrified French morale and marked the beginning of a new momentum. Joan soon led further victories, including the Battle of Kadesh in June 1429. But her growing fame made her enemies, both in the English ranks and among factions within the French court. In 1430, she was captured by the English and put on trial for heresy and witchcraft. She was accused of dressing as a man, claiming to hear divine voices, and practicing sorcery. Despite the brutal trial, Joan stood firm in her faith, insisting she was fulfilling God's will. In 1431, at the age of 19, she was found guilty and burned at the stake. 2 decades later, in the Battle of Castillon, Charles VII led the French to a decisive victory over the English, bringing an end to English territorial claims in France and, in many ways, fulfilling Joan's mission. Meanwhile, in the once great city of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was in steep decline, weakened by centuries of war, political instability, and economic hardship. In contrast, the rising Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, saw an opportunity. Constantinople, a strategic crossroads of trade and empire, was within his sights. By 1453, Mehmed II assembled a massive army of 80,000 soldiers, including elite Janissary troops and powerful artillery. They laid siege to the city. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. For nearly 2 months, the Ottomans relentlessly bombarded the city's ancient walls, weakening its defenses. Inside the city, morale crumbled as supplies ran low and reinforcements failed to arrive. Then, on May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Using siege towers and scaling ladders, Ottoman forces breached the crumbling walls. Despite a brave defense, the Byzantines were overwhelmed, and the Ottomans stormed the city, capturing the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. With the fall of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire came to an end. All paths no longer led to Rome, and the last vestiges of Caesar's empire were erased. In its place rose a new power, Ottoman rule, ushering in an era of Turkish dominance in the Eastern Mediterranean. While the Byzantine Empire was falling, Russia was beginning to rise. At the time, the Mongol Empire still held sway over Russian lands, demanding heavy tribute from towns across the region. But in 1472, Ivan III, Ivan the Great, refused to pay. Over the next few years, Ivan strengthened his military and pushed back Mongol influence, gradually reclaiming control of key cities and territories. Then, in 1480, the Mongols demanded tribute once more, threatening war if it was not paid. Ivan stood his ground. After a tense standoff, the Mongols retreated without a fight. This quiet victory marked the end of Mongol domination and the beginning of a free and independent Russia. In 1492, while Russia was asserting its sovereignty, Europe was looking outward. Christopher Columbus, seeking a western sea route to India, set sail across the Atlantic. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas, on an island he named San Salvador. There, he encountered the Lucayans, skilled fishermen and farmers, who welcomed the newcomers and offered food and supplies. Though Columbus never reached Asia, his voyage opened the door to a new and irreversible chapter in world history: the European discovery and colonization of the Americas. Back in Europe, a cultural revolution was taking shape: the Renaissance. In 1503, Leonardo da Vinci completed his masterpiece, the Mona Lisa. His biographer, Walter Isaacson, wrote, "The way the smile flickers makes it a work of art and science." Leonardo understood optics, the muscles of the lips, and how light strikes the eye. All of it goes into making the Mona Lisa's smile so mysterious and elusive. In 1504, Michelangelo unveiled his statue of David. He once said, "In every block of marble, I see a statue as plain as though it stood before me. I have only to hew away the rough walls that imprison the lovely apparition to reveal it." And in 1506, Michelangelo began painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, one of the most celebrated works in Western art. In the political world, Niccolò Machiavelli penned one of the most influential works in Western thought, The Prince. More than a political guide, it was a stark reflection on the nature of power, shaped by the rise and fall of civilizations we've seen in this very timeline. Machiavelli famously wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment, which never fails." Consider the ordinary farmer, spending his life toiling in the fields, handing over crops as taxes to a noble lord who offers little in return but protection. Why didn't the farmers rise up? Because without their lords, they feared something worse: that the Huns, the Mongols, or any other threat could descend upon them unchecked. Fear kept the system intact. But not all were willing to accept how things were. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther challenged one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the Catholic Church. At the time, the Church was selling indulgences, certificates promising to shorten one's time in purgatory in exchange for money. To Luther, this was not just corrupt, it was a betrayal of the Bible's core teachings. Repentance and faith, not wealth, lead to salvation. In protest, Luther wrote 95 theses, arguments calling for reform. On October 31, 1517, he nailed them to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, publicly inviting debate. The result was explosive. His writings sparked heated debate among scholars, clergy, and rulers across Europe. Some hailed him as a prophet. Others branded him a heretic. But one thing was clear: the Protestant Reformation had begun. In 1519, Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived on the shores of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs welcomed them with lavish gifts of gold and silver, believing the Spaniards might be emissaries of the god Quetzalcoatl. But Cortés had no divine mission. His true goal was conquest. Over the next 2 years, he waged a brutal campaign against the Aztecs, aided by superior weapons like guns and cannons, and crucially by indigenous allies who opposed Aztec rule. Though vastly outnumbered, Cortés slowly gained ground. In 1521, after months of siege and bloodshed, the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan fell. The empire was crushed, and Spanish rule began. Following Cortés' playbook, Francisco Pizarro set his sights on the Incan Empire in present-day Peru. With far fewer men, he too toppled a vast indigenous civilization through manipulation, force, and betrayal. Yet perhaps the deadliest weapon the Europeans brought wasn't steel, but disease. Immunized by centuries of exposure to plagues like smallpox, the Spanish carried viruses that spread rapidly among native populations. With no natural resistance, millions perished, not just by the sword, but by invisible enemies they never saw coming. When Suleiman the Magnificent took the throne, the Ottoman Empire was already a formidable power, but under his rule, it reached its absolute peak, becoming one of the most dominant and influential empires in world history. Suleiman was more than just a ruler. He was a brilliant strategist, a masterful military commander, and a shrewd statesman who turned the empire into a force feared and respected across continents. Like many legendary leaders before him, he dreamed of shaping the world in his image, and came remarkably close to doing so. By the end of his reign, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the rivers of southeastern Europe to the burning sands of Arabia, and from the Mediterranean shores to the plains of Persia. His army seized Belgrade and Budapest in Europe, Jerusalem and Mecca in the Middle East, and Tabriz and Baghdad in Persia. The Ottomans also ruled the seas. Their fleets dominated the Mediterranean, controlling key North African ports like Algiers and Tunis. But Suleiman's legacy wasn't just about military might. He presided over a golden age, a unique Ottoman civilization that blended Eastern and Western traditions, Islamic law, and remarkable achievements in art, architecture, and culture. It was, without a doubt, the zenith of Ottoman power. But even empires can stumble when ruled by passion. King Henry VIII, notorious for his ruthless streak, fell deeply for Anne Boleyn and was determined to make her his queen. There was only one problem. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, was still alive, and the Catholic Church refused to grant a divorce. Henry's solution was as bold as it was seismic. In 1534, he broke from Rome entirely, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England through the Act of Supremacy. The Pope excommunicated him, but the split was irreversible. What began as a king's desire for a new wife ignited a permanent schism between England and the Catholic Church, a divide that still shapes history today. Ivan IV, remembered as Ivan the Terrible, rose to power as the first crowned Tsar of Russia. In the early years of his reign, he was a capable and ambitious ruler, expanding Russia's borders through successful military campaigns against neighboring kingdoms, and commissioning grand projects like the iconic St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. But power changed him. Over time, Ivan grew increasingly suspicious and unpredictable. Advisors and nobles who questioned him faced his volatile temper, and often execution. In 1560, the sudden death of his beloved wife Anastasia shattered him. Consumed by grief and paranoia, Ivan descended into brutality. He unleashed the infamous Oprichnina, a reign of terror marked by mass executions, torture, and the destruction of entire towns. Thousands of Russians perished, their homes and livelihoods erased, sealing Ivan's legacy as one of history's most ruthless rulers. While Russia endured Ivan the Terrible's reign of fear, England was entering a golden age under Queen Elizabeth I. her era sparked the English Renaissance, a flourishing of art, literature, and national pride. Theaters filled with audiences eager for poetic language and stories that captured the drama of human ambition. William Shakespeare became the towering figure of the age, writing histories such as Julius Caesar, about the Roman ruler's assassination, King John set amid England's medieval struggles, and Henry VIII exploring the personal and political battles for power. He was joined by other celebrated playwrights, including Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and John Webster, whose works helped define an era. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, England planted its first permanent colony in North America, Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607 by the Virginia Company. To the north, French explorer Samuel de Champlain was founding Quebec in 1608, laying the cornerstone of France's presence in the New World. Back in Europe, a new era of conflict erupted: the 30 Years' War. What began in 1618 as a religious dispute between Protestants and Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire soon spiraled into one of the most destructive wars in European history. It started when the Holy Roman Emperor tried to impose Catholicism on the largely Protestant region of Bohemia. The Bohemians rebelled, and the spark ignited a continent-wide inferno. For the next 3 decades, armies marched and countermarched across Europe, leaving cities in ruins and populations decimated. The war brought brutal sieges, merciless massacres, and atrocities committed by both sides. At its height, it drew in most of Europe's major powers: France, Spain, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire, and transformed from a purely religious struggle into a battle for political dominance and economic control. The conflict finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. The treaty recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, affirmed the sovereignty of individual states within the Holy Roman Empire, and brought an end to the religious wars that had torn Europe apart. Yet, the devastation it left behind would scar the continent for generations. In China, the once mighty Ming court was rotting from within. Corruption, factional rivalries, and economic decline crippled the empire. Emperor Chongzhen faced mounting pressure to strengthen the military against the rising Manchu threat, but political infighting and a shortage of resources left his defenses in shambles. In 1644, the Manchu army, led by Prince Dorgan, swept into China. The Ming forces, weakened by years of neglect, were no match for the disciplined and battle-hardened invaders. Beijing fell swiftly, and the Manchus installed their own emperor, ending nearly 3 centuries of Ming rule and beginning the Qing dynasty, continuing China's cycle of dynasties. Meanwhile, in Spain, the death of King Charles II without an heir triggered a European power struggle. Louis XIV of France pushed for his grandson, Philip, to take the Spanish throne, a move aimed at extending French influence. Opposing him, Emperor Leopold I of Austria backed Archduke Charles of the Habsburg dynasty, hoping to block France's expansion. The dispute erupted into the War of the Spanish Succession, drawing in most of Europe's great powers. France and Spain stood against a coalition of Austria, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and others. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Philip was recognized as King of Spain, but was forced to renounce any claim to the French crown, while Spain ceded key territories to Britain and Austria. The Treaty of Rastatt in 1714 sealed the peace, reshaping Europe's balance of power. In 1707, the parliaments of England and Scotland passed the Acts of Union, merging the 2 kingdoms into a single political entity, Great Britain. It was a legal milestone that laid the foundation for the British state we know today. But not everyone celebrated. In Scotland, resentment brewed. Many saw the Union as a loss of sovereignty, and the decades that followed saw uprisings, most notably the Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, aimed at restoring the Scottish monarchy and independence. On July 4, 1776, in Philadelphia, a group of American patriots signed a declaration that would change the course of history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With those words, the American Revolution was in full motion, and the colonies had set themselves on a collision course with the British Empire. While war raged across the Atlantic, Europe was having a very different kind of revolution, one of ideas and culture. In 1776, Scottish economist Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, laying the foundation for modern economics. His radical argument: free markets could regulate themselves without heavy government control. Meanwhile, in Austria, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was enchanting audiences with his Hafner's Serenade, a graceful and elegant composition filled with light, courtly dances, and lyrical melodies. It was a reminder that even in turbulent times, beauty and creativity flourished. As the war dragged on, King George III poured troops into America. The colonists, though lacking formal military training, used their intimate knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics to outmaneuver the British. Red-coated soldiers stood out against the countryside, while the Americans seemed to vanish into it. In the summer of 1781, General George Washington and French commander Rochambeau marched their combined forces to Virginia, laying siege to General Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British were trapped. No escape by land, no escape by sea. For weeks, American and French artillery pounded their defenses, while trenches crept ever closer. Off the coast, the French Navy dealt a decisive blow to the British fleet, sealing Cornwallis's fate. On October 14th, American and French troops launched a full assault. Outnumbered and outgunned, the British lines began to collapse. 5 days later, on October 19th, Cornwallis surrendered. The victory at Yorktown was more than just a battlefield triumph. It marked the end of British rule in the colonies and the birth of a new nation. With independence won, the United States faced a new question. How should the nation be led? Some even wondered if General George Washington should become king. But the founders rejected monarchy, choosing instead the radical experiment of democracy. Still, there was unease. As the philosopher Plato had warned centuries earlier, the average citizen might lack the wisdom to choose the best leader. At the Constitutional Convention, the solution became the Electoral College, a system where citizens would vote for electors, and those electors would choose the president. It was a compromise between direct democracy and elite oversight, designed to balance the will of the people with the judgment of the nation's leaders. Whether it succeeded in that mission is a debate that continues to this day. Inspired by the success of the American Revolution, the people of France turned against their own monarchy. At the time, the nation was ruled by King Louis XVI and his famously out-of-touch queen, Marie Antoinette, remembered perhaps unfairly for the phrase, "let them eat cake." In 1789, frustrated by poverty, inequality, and the monarchy's indifference, the people formed the National Assembly and began drafting laws to expand their rights. The breaking point came with the storming of the Bastille, a prison that symbolized royal tyranny. The crowd tore it down, freeing its prisoners and igniting a revolution that swept across France. The guillotine soon became a grim emblem of change. Both King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, as France tried to reinvent itself as a republic. One of the revolution's rising figures was Maximilien Robespierre. Initially a defender of the common people, he quickly gained influence, becoming a dominant voice in the National Assembly and a member of the powerful Committee of Public Safety in 1793. But Robespierre's vision hardened into extremism. Determined to protect the revolution at any cost, he unleashed the Reign of Terror, a year of mass arrests, political purges, and public executions. Thousands were condemned, often on the flimsiest of charges. By 1794, the violence had spiraled out of control, and Robespierre's enemies turned against him. On July 28th, he and his closest allies met the same fate as so many before them: the guillotine. In the aftermath, France abandoned radical republicanism in favor of the Directory, a 5-man executive council chosen by the Council of Elders. It was meant to balance competing factions, but the system was fragile, and the nation's revolution was far from over. The Directory proved weak and ineffective, and in 1799, a brilliant and ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized the moment. Overthrowing the government in a coup, he set out to reshape Europe under his rule. In 1805, he achieved one of his greatest triumphs at the Battle of Austerlitz, defeating a combined Austro-Russian army and cementing his status as Europe's dominant military power. Soon, much of the continent fell under his control: Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and vast swaths of Central Europe. But in 1812, Napoleon made a fatal gamble: the invasion of Russia. His massive army, the Grande Armée, advanced deep into Russian territory, only to be crippled by scorched-earth tactics, fierce resistance, and the brutal winter. Few returned. By 1814, his enemies had united. The European powers invaded France, forcing Napoleon to abdicate and accept exile on the island of Elba. Yet he was not finished. In 1815, he escaped and returned to power for a brief, dramatic chapter known as the 100 Days. It ended in his crushing defeat at the Battle of Waterloo by British and Prussian forces, sealing his fate and ending his dream of European domination. Across the Atlantic, Simón Bolívar, the Liberator, was waging a relentless campaign to free Latin America from a Spanish colonial rule. His fight began in Venezuela in 1810 with a successful uprising against Spanish authority. From there, he moved into Colombia, securing a decisive victory at the Battle of Boyacá in 1819, which guaranteed Colombian independence. Bolívar then turned south, leading campaigns in Ecuador and Peru, capturing Lima in 1824 and breaking Spain's grip on the region. His final triumph came in 1825 with the liberation of Upper Peru, renamed Bolivia in his honor. By the end of his campaigns, Bolívar had helped create a new map of Latin America, inspiring independence movements across the continent. In 1848, two radical thinkers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, published the Communist Manifesto, a work that would ignite political debates for generations. They condemned the capitalist system, in which the bourgeoisie owned the wealth while the proletariat labored for meager wages. Their vision was revolutionary: a world where the working class collectively owned the means of production and shared equally in its rewards. In their famous words, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." Marx and Engels also described capitalism's relentless drive to expand. The need for a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. In the decades after the Communist Manifesto was published, Europe turned its attention to Africa in a frenzied race for land and resources. Known as the Scramble for Africa, it began in the 1870s, when European powers sent explorers and missionaries deep into the continent to map its interior, forge trade links, and secure alliances with local rulers. At first, expansion was cautious, but competition quickly escalated into aggression. Armies marched in to claim territories, treaties were manipulated, and propaganda swayed public opinion. Perhaps the most devastating tactic was the carving up of Africa with artificial borders, dividing ethnic groups, splitting languages, and igniting rivalries the colonizers could exploit. The goal was simple: to lock the continent into Europe's economic grip. By the early 20th century, the scramble began to fade. Rising African resistance, shifting economic priorities, and growing rivalries between European powers diverted attention away from further colonization. Those same rivalries would soon explode into something far more destructive. On June 28, 1914, a gunshot in Sarajevo set the world on fire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist. The killing triggered a chain reaction. Austria, Hungary declared war on Serbia. Germany, its ally, declared war on Russia and France. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgium, declared war on Germany. Within weeks, nearly all of Europe was engulfed in a conflict of unprecedented scale. World War I had begun. For 4 years, the war dragged on: trench warfare, massive offensives, and unimaginable loss of life. Finally, on November 11, 1918, an armistice was signed. The guns fell silent, ending not only the fighting but also centuries of Ottoman dominance in the Middle East. The world, however, had been irreversibly changed. The fragile peace after World War I shattered in 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Like conquerors before him, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Hitler sought an empire, but his ambitions went further. To create a dominion so vast it would make the Roman Empire seem small. His vision was built on conquest and cruelty, targeting entire peoples he deemed undesirable. The war raged across continents, but by April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. From the east, Soviet forces stormed Berlin. From the west, Allied armies closed in. After weeks of fierce fighting, Berlin fell on May 2nd. 5 days later, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, ending the war in Europe. In the Pacific, the conflict ended months later after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's surrender brought World War II to a close, but the world that emerged was forever changed. Out of the war came a technological revolution. Alan Turing's work on early computing laid the foundation for a new, interconnected world. Yet, geopolitics remained tense. For nearly half a century, the United States and the Soviet Union faced off in the Cold War. A global contest fought through proxy wars, espionage, and an arms race, despite being separated by oceans and ideology. In 1969, humanity reached beyond Earth when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, declaring,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Over the decades, technology accelerated. Computers became affordable, cell phones transformed communication, and the planet felt smaller than ever before. The ancient story of Gilgamesh still speaks to us. In his quest for immortality, the hero learns a hard truth. Life, which you look for, you will never find. For when the gods created man, they let death be his share, and life they withheld in their own hands. History, too, is an unfinished book, rewritten with every generation. Empires will rise and fall. People will seek safety and meaning. And no matter how much the world changes, some truths remain eternal.